Zi.Tools is a great free resource for exploring Chinese characters. See what it has to offer and how you can use it to boost your learning. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we're going to talk about a tool that you can use for exploring Chinese characters. It is online, it is web-based, and it is free. The resource is called Zi.Tools, so that's Zi as in Hanzi, so Z-I, and then .tools. I will of course also link to the resource in the show notes. Pro tip though, if you want people to be able to pronounce your site and your service, don't mix languages in the title. As mentioned, this website is about looking up information about characters. And in a sense, this is very easy to do as a student. There are many websites and apps that give you information about characters. But on the other hand, it's very hard to find information because a lot of what you find online and in apps is actually wrong. One of the main problems when it comes to analyzing Chinese characters is that many services don't do this manually. They simply break down characters mechanically based on what components look like and then tell you that this is how the characters are composed, which is true in a graphical sense, but that's not really how the characters came about, and sometimes it's outright misleading. So a good example of this is the character Mu, which means tree, and it looks like a plus sign where you've added two slanting strokes to the bottom left and bottom right if you don't know how to write it. This character is then analyzed as having two components. One is 10, shi, the cross bit, and the other one is 8, ba, the slanting strokes. And this is just nonsense. This is a pictograph of a tree, and if you look at the evolution of this character, you can see that it started out looking more like a tree, and actually, to be honest, it still looks like a tree in the modern form. It has nothing to do with 10 or 8. So that's an example of a graphical breakdown. It has nothing to do with the history of the characters, it merely looks at the surface forms and what they look like. Another common problem is that there are many folk etymologies out there, so these can sometimes be very old, sometimes thousands of years old, where somebody thought a character came about in a certain way, but we actually know better today. That was not how this character came about, and yet this story has been perpetuated for so long that people think it's true. And a good example of this might be Mei, beautiful, which is often said to consist of big and sheep. In ancient times then, big sheep were beautiful, or maybe it was a beautiful thing to have big sheep. This is not how this character came about, however, which becomes clear if you look at the evolution of this character and at the earliest forms. It's actually a person wearing some kind of fancy headgear. Naturally, there are also people who just make things up, and so looking up information about characters online is not easy. Before we move on, I'd like to mention that I have talked about the question of how deep you should go into the etymological rabbit hole, as it were, in episode 29. So I do think that you should learn more about characters and how they work, but it's not always necessary to learn everything about all the characters. Then you will end up studying characters more than you study the actual language and how they are used. But check out episode 29 for more about that. The main reason you want to get things right about characters is that understanding how they work can be really helpful when you're trying to learn a lot of them. And so sticking to methods or using information that misleads you is not terribly useful, and it can actually make it harder to learn the characters. So the resource I want to recommend in this episode is not about understanding characters as such on a system level, it's more about looking up information about individual characters. If you don't already know how Chinese characters work, I suggest you check out Outlier Linguistics' Chinese Character Masterclass, which I reviewed in episode 186. There is also a free series of articles on hacking Chinese that takes you through the basics. But let's get back to Zi.Tools, which is what I want to talk about in this episode. So at its core, it's a website that collates information from many different sources about characters. So if you look anything up, you are bound to find much more information here than in most online resources I've tried. This can sometimes be a bit overwhelming, but we'll get to downsides later. Let's focus on why I think this is a useful resource first. It works like a normal online dictionary. You can paste characters, type characters, or use a compose tool if you want to use different components and can't type what you want to look up, but otherwise it works as you would expect an electronic dictionary to work. When you hit enter, however, you will not just find the pinyin, a few example sentences, and a translation. Instead, you will find dozens of pages of information, depending a little bit on what character you are looking up. This means that whatever you were looking for, it's likely that it is on the page you're now looking at. The problem is that it can be a little bit hard to find, especially since this site was not specifically designed for second language learners, and most of the interface is in Chinese. Don't let that scare you away though. I will talk a little bit more about how to use it here, and you can also refer to the written article on Hacking Chinese, which has screenshots which explain what things mean. To begin with, you are presented with an overview of how this character is composed, if it is a compound. They use colored lines to describe the function of each component. So let's say you're looking up the character ma, which means mother, and consists of nu, woman, and ma, horse. So nu here is related to the meaning, and it has a red line. And then ma is related to the sound, and it has a blue line. If you look up the simplified version, you can also find a gray line indicating that there is actually another character behind this, which is the traditional character ma. And this gray one is used when indicating that this is not the original character, or there might be some character corruption or other things going on that makes it not as it seems. There are no translations of the components here, but they do use specific icons for the various components, so you can see that a horse is a horse and a woman is a woman, etc. You can then also see the standard form of this character, and there can be more than one, since there are more than one standard, and these are also written in Chinese. So for example, if it says Lu, that means Da Lu as in mainland China, or if it says Tai, that means Tai as in Taiwan, and that means it's a Taiwan standard, and so on. And there are more than these, but you can check the website for more details. I should also mention that the colored lines can sometimes be dotted to indicate other things, maybe that a component doesn't mean something, but it's used to indicate meaning. And I should also say that if you have no idea what I'm talking about when I say that components have specific functions, and I'm talking about sound components and meaning components, do check out that series of articles I mentioned. The first article is called The Building Blocks of Chinese Part 1, Chinese Characters and Words in a Nutshell. As mentioned, Zi.Tools is not designed for second language learners, which means that the legends and explanations are all in Chinese. However, I have translated those in the written article on Hacking Chinese, and I'm not going to read out my translations here. They don't make much sense if you're not also looking at a screenshot, but head over to Hacking Chinese for more details. So far so good. Many of these things you can also find in other online dictionaries, but then as you scroll down you get much more information, probably much more than you needed, but at least you can be relatively sure that what you're looking for is there. One of the more interesting sections is character origin, and here you can see lots of different sources explaining this character. This is in itself not useful unless you know which these sources are, and there is a mix of different types of sources here that carry very different weight. For example, one of the sources is 说文解字, which was written almost 2,000 years ago, and many of the folk etymologies I mentioned earlier actually come from this book. But we know a lot more about characters now than we did 2,000 years ago. We have a lot more archaeological data, for example, and remember that when this book was written, the earliest characters were already ancient history, and so it's not a surprise that we today actually know much more. For contrast, we also have 说文新正, which is a modern academic work of paleography, which is far more reliable. To illustrate, we can return to the earlier example of Mei, beautiful, which 说文 analyzes as big plus sheep equals beautiful. But if you look at 说文新正, we get the full explanation, and it even explains why it is that 说文 got this wrong. The drawback here, if your reading ability is not already quite good, is that the explanations are in Chinese. However, it's not that hard to translate, and using AI here works pretty well. While you're on the page for a specific character, you can also see how it has evolved over time, and you can see how different calligraphers have written this character over time as well. Finally, I'd like to highlight that there is a comparison chart that can be very useful if you want to compare different standards. It's located in the left sidebar and easy to miss, but the idea is that if you are confused about, say, which variant of a character you're supposed to use, you can look it up there, because as I've mentioned earlier, it can be different in Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, and so on. I did say finally, but there is actually a lot more information about each character you look up. It's just that for most learners this information is not terribly useful, but feel free to scroll down all the way to the bottom if you really want to. So let's round this off by comparing Zi.Tools to another resource that I often recommend, which is the Outlier Chinese Character Dictionary. I did mention their character masterclass earlier, but this is not the same thing. This is simply a dictionary, a one-off purchase for Pleco, which will give you access to a lot of the same information that is on Zi.Tools. However, I think the only advantage of Zi.Tools is that it is online and you don't have to use a phone. And it's also free, but since the character dictionary is a one-off purchase, it is a no-brainer if you're interested in characters. You should just get it. So the main disadvantages with Zi.Tools is that it's not meant for language learners, which means that things are in Chinese and they don't really tell you how things work, etc. And that there is too much information. And sometimes too much information means that you don't know where to look for what you actually need to know. But if you are using Outlier, they will just tell you in plain English what you want to know, so you don't need to go and look for it. And sometimes having an expert tell you that this is the important bit is worth quite a lot. It also means that a human has looked at this character and then presented it to you as a learner in a way that they thought suitable, whereas on Zi.Tools you get all the information at once. A good example of this is the difference between 说文解字, so that's the 2,000-year-old character dictionary, and 说文新政, which is the new academic work. And if you don't know anything about this, there is no way for you to know which of these you're supposed to trust when they don't say the same thing. But in Outlier's dictionary, they just use the most relevant evidence and tell you what they think the conclusion is. And usually that's following 说文新政, by the way. And if you look at the sources that Outlier uses for their dictionary, you can see that this book occurs all over the place. It's also worth mentioning that since it collects a lot of information and data from different sites, it could be less trustworthy in a sense. It's basically just saying this site over here or this book over here says this. While it doesn't make a decision, it doesn't tell you that this one is better or more useful or more true or something like that. And sometimes that's exactly what you want, and then this site is not very good. On the whole though, I love Zi.Tools. I use it almost every day when I look up information about characters. I want to find different versions of the character, try to figure out what standard where or what different sources say about the etymology or something like that. So for me, this is very useful. I think it's safe to say that this website becomes more useful the more Chinese you know, but it can still be useful on lower levels if you know what you're looking for and you have a specific purpose in mind. But then again, you should check my article on Hacking Chinese to see how to find the information you are after. So go check it out and let me know what you think. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.